This is an overview of the economic and human movement section, and I've entitled it Fluid, Spaghetti, and Rebar because it brings three different dimensions of multidimensional challenges in studying bordering processes, and again using the territorial and aterritorial frame. I'm using territorial in the context of emphasis on national and subnational discretion as a key factor in bordering policy. So it's not simply the location of where borders are administered, but the location of the decision-making processes. Aterritorial, focusing on the interaction of external and domestic political, regulatory, economic, and technological factors. And aterritorial bordering in this context may involve a projection of power, in a sense being unilateral. It may involve negotiation, but most frequently, in the economic sphere at least, it involves parallelism, where there are extraterritorial influences to which national or subnational governments are responding in ways that are similar to those from outside the country, but particularly in the Canadian case with the United States, but not exclusively so, but also with adaptations for national and subnational, varied national and subnational considerations. Now, as a 10-minute project, this is a challenge because we're dealing with human movements, North American and wider international trade, international investment flows and stocks, trade and investment, sometimes being complementary, sometimes being replacement, and international regulatory cooperation, which is where we get into the nuts and bolts of managing both border and behind the border regulatory issues that influence trade and investment. And finally, as we have time, we'll look at border infrastructure. Bordering processes for defining, negotiating, and structuring the rights and responsibility of, yes, of states towards one another, but also towards their respective citizens and residents in establishing and managing territorial and jurisdictional boundaries. And this involves various forms of fluidity, fluidity in market movements, fluidity in human movements, both formal and informal, the whole substitution effect, but also fluidity of policies in response to different formats. Given the fact that Canada and Canadians or businesses located in Canada interact across a wide range of borders, not just the Canada-US border. We have the problem of what Jagdish Bhagwati has called the spaghetti bowl, in Asia the noodle bowl, the interaction of different trading arrangements, investment arrangements, agreements between countries. And to order the spaghetti, we need some kind of rebar, reinforcing steel rods, for those of you who aren't familiar with construction, that provide domestic and international institutions to stabilize these processes, particularly in a period of instability. Now, looking at human movements, we see a significant dichotomy between functions along land borders and air borders. I'll talk about more of this with tomorrow's paper, but auto travel remains the primary means of cross-border travel, heavily dependent on secure identification, particularly passports. Americans have started to catch up with Canadians on this, in this area, but there are huge regional variations. But rather than security being the dominant variable as it was between 2001 and 2009, relative economic conditions, particularly exchange rates, have become a critical factor. In terms of trade flows, we're seeing increased automation at the border for customs clearance. This favors those who are most deeply invested in cross-border trade. It's hard on small traders. And we have extensive information sharing. This is the most significant element of institutional interaction, most recently with the entry-exit systems where exit data from the United States and Canada becomes entry data for the other country. However, we have very, very limited use of joint enforcement techniques at the border. Shiprider is one of the exceptions. Air borders are significantly different. The governance context for air borders is hugely different. And cross-border travel by air has grown asymmetrically to that involving land borders over the last 15 years. for Canadians, for Americans, and for foreigners. There's been a huge drop, as I'll note tomorrow, for Americans crossing the border, significant increases for Canadians, but more so for air borders than land borders. And there's huge institutional cooperation in the field. By the very nature of the field, it is very largely territorial in the governance, but with significant territorial exceptions, particularly cabotage. In terms of regulating human movements, national visa rules are a key element in regulating irregular migration, particularly travels for countries with high volumes of unsuccessful asylum claims. With regard to migration, our finding is that immigration policies are primarily territorial. This is partly because of the total dysfunctionality of American immigration policies over the last 25 to 30 years, but also the very different policy emphasis on economic migration in Canada, very different constitutional context, legal context. And here we see an interesting phenomenon of provincial nomination program. Provinces having shared joint jurisdiction with the federal government, playing an increasingly active role in immigration policies, particularly for economic migrants. We've seen the ups and downs of temporary worker programs. Meredith Lilly has written about that and is doing more work in that area. In terms of irregular migration, we have historic challenges of the efficient processing of refugee claimants because of Canadian constitutional requirements. Part of that with the United States we've regulated through the Safe Third Country Agreement. However, the spread of technologies, particularly social media, has resulted in the huge a gaping hole in these management systems and the need for new means of sorting out people with a genuine fear of persecution from economic migrants using the asylum system. With trade policies and borders, we could talk for 10 minutes on that quite easily. Our assessment is there has been a widespread rebordering, often using asymmetrical bordering techniques, often using aterritorial bordering techniques. And this does not just exist within North America as a result of the Trump administration. It has multiple functions. The key analytical finding is the sectoral variations and the huge variations in terms of cooperation, collaboration, or parallelism or unilateralism in different sectors, and I don't have time to deal with that today. Technologically, electronic commerce is a key factor that is shaping the changes at a number of levels that can be dealt with in question and answer if anybody is interested. In terms of investment, we had a period through about 2010 where WTO rules were facilitating the liberalization of investment, basically debordering investment rules except in a very narrow range of sectors, with aterritorial processes such as investor-state dispute resolution. However, we are seeing ongoing restrictions in strategic and security-related sectors. And again, Canadian provinces have played a more active role until very recently than the federal government. Key issue for the federal government is security, particularly state-owned enterprises, particularly from authoritarian countries like, but not exclusively, China. We have done a lot of work in the area of international regulatory cooperation. These efforts have been periodic, but again, the institutional nature of the field suggests that it is very policy sector specific and sometimes product sector and subsector specific. And the degree and nature of international regulatory cooperation depends on the relative interdependence, but also the relative market concentration of Canadian export markets to the United States. More diversified markets for particular subsectors, the more difficult it is to have regulatory cooperation, the more we tend to look towards means of mutual recognition, sometimes with functional equivalence. On infrastructure, we're not just looking at border infrastructure, but border corridors because of the integration of North American markets and transportation systems. This has been reinforced by the market integration of major traded sectors, but the efficiency of border infrastructure is heavily dependent on intergovernmental cooperation. This is far more extensive within Canada between federal and provincial governments because of federal leadership than it is between Canada and the United States. In conclusion, Most international economic flows are subject to varied mixtures of territorial and aterritorial forces. Same goes for human movements. Migration policies are primarily territorial, reflecting varied national priorities and societal trade-offs. International institutions facilitate policy parallelism more than policy integration because of the relative absence of reciprocity in many policy fields. Particularly the greater the number of players one has. And finally, we are seeing limits to and a retreat from reciprocity, not just within North America, but also in Canada's dealing with China. And I think this is visible not just in Canada, but the United States and parts of Europe. And this retreat from reciprocity is reinforcing or necessitating the preservation of national capacity